My name is Brian Sturgeon. I'm being asked to moderate this session. I'm on the OCEPP advisory board. I'm the only academic. There's a few academics left in the room, which is maybe why they asked me to moderate. You'll see 10 people up here on stage, not including myself. It's going to be a bit of a trick to get through within the hour we have left. I should give a bit of a preamble. If you've looked at the title of the session, it's called Emerging Issues in Engineering Regulation. And the way they've set this up is we have 6 speakers on my left who have asked to give a 5-minute presentation from the organization they're representing on their view of the issue. So the intent to plan is everyone gets to stand up, do their 5 minutes, and they sit down. On my right are 4 panelists who I think have been chosen for their outspokenness. And my biggest problem, I think, will be trying to rein in the panelists so we can get in time. But as I said, the speakers will do their 5 minutes, then the panelists get to respond, and we'll definitely try and keep aside at least 15 minutes for the floor. Because I'm sure, as we've seen during the course of the day, it's the floor that can get things interesting. With that, I guess I'll work my way through the panel first, beginning on my right. Jackie Slonka-Perrin is a PEng and founder and consultant at Decision Maker Model Associates. Next to her is Ted Alongicha, sorry Ted, Director Code and Standards, Chief Engineer, Electrical Safety Authority. Gary Thompson, no he's not. Johnny is sitting to his right. Hard to confuse those two. Johnny Zucon is the Deputy Registrar, Tribunals and Regulatory Affairs, Professional Engineers Ontario. And to his right, and on my extreme right, is Gary Thompson, who is Supervisor, Generation Planning and Transmission Capacity, Toronto Hydro, and a member of the OCEPP Advisory Board. That's our distinguished challengers. On my left, and Paul, anyways, just formally, Paul Accioni is the president of OSPE. He's also a managing consultant with MIDAC Corporation. To his side is Terry. Terry Obel is president, Association of the Chemical Profession of Ontario, also director of Scientific Services and Development of Maximum Analytics. Beside Terry is Robin. Robin Dunn is past president of the Ontario Association of Certified Engineering Technicians and Technologists. He's also the chief administrative officer for the township of Orendo-Madona. To Robin's left is Deanna Hago, who is the member of the Association of Registered Engineers Designers of Ontario, and also already given a great segue from Susan. Second last is Bill DeAngelis, who is the past chair of Consulting Engineers of Ontario. He's also the Vice President and General Manager of Associated Engineering. And right against the window there, our last person to be introduced is Marc Bourgeois, who is the Director, Communications and Public Affairs, Engineers Canada. That is our distinguished set of speakers. With that, I'm going to ask Paul to step forward and, as they say, set the show on the road.
Thank you, Brian. I'm going to start by asking 5 nasty questions, and hopefully we'll have a little discussion about some of these. Some of them have all been already raised today by various speakers, and I'm pleasantly surprised that it's on somebody's list. Those 5 items were on somebody's list today. My first question is it time to require certificate of authorization holders and corporations that have their own engineering departments to have and use a quality engineering program? Fred DeMarker was up here earlier. I know Fred's program. I used to work at OPG many moons ago. Their program, they found the number of errors and rework dropped dramatically, and the safety of the plant and the workers rose dramatically after they implemented a formal QA program back in 1977-78. It took a little while to iron out the loose ends, but now it's working pretty good. The next question is it time to indemnify clients and owners who accept responsibility or who accept advice from a professional engineer? In other words, a law that says you can't sue the owner or the client if they're working on the advice of an engineer. I'm not sure too many engineering firms want that much responsibility and that much liability, but here's the deal. I've been a director of a condominium corporation, and I can tell you when you have a clause like that in the act that affects you as a board of director, you always seek the advice of an engineer, and you never violate the advice of an engineer, because you're totally protected from legal liability. The problem is the engineers that do the work have all the liability, and they have to have the insurance to carry it. But it makes for one beautiful way to run engineering when engineers are not told, sorry, we can't afford it, sorry, I don't like your idea, it's too much trouble, blah, 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 right? So that's a change I would love to see someday before I die. Number 3, it's in the Condominium Act, by the way, for condominium corporations, and it works like a charm. Is it time to restrict the personal exemption? We talked about the personal exemption allowing organizations like OPG and others to have one licensed engineer supervise a bunch of non-licensed people. It's helpful, but here in Ontario it's a global exemption, which means we can have a floor sweeper doing engineering work if an engineer is willing to accept responsibility. That's taking it a little far. It's never happened at OPG, but technically it can happen and you can't do anything about it. In PEI, only technicians and technologists are allowed to use the personal exemption. In 3 or 4 other provinces, it's interns, technicians, and technologists. And out of deference to Fred, I suggest we add scientists in there in Ontario. Number 4, is it time for PEO to recognize that all engineers are in fact in limited practice. We can't do everything, I hope, ourselves. We use a team to get things done. We are all in limited practice. And therefore, all holders with independent rights to practice should all get the PEng. That means the limited license holder should get a PEng. Number 5, if the industrial exemption repeal is cancelled, God forbid today, they're having a cabinet meeting. Has anybody heard? Wednesday. Thank goodness, we got another day to cry. What can PEO and OCEPP, we'd like to work with PEO to help in this issue because we think it's important for the profession. We should do things together on this one. What do we do to educate the public on why it's important for all engineering practitioners to be licensed? That's it. I hope I'm within my time, yeah? Good.
That was perfect, Paul. So that was given the perspective of OSP. Now we get Terry to give the perspective of the Association of Chemical Profession. Great. And you've got a PowerPoint?
Yeah, I do. That's right.
Yep, you're good.
Beautiful. Well, I want to thank OCEPP for the opportunity to present in front of this panel. In Ontario today, there are no requirements for service standards to practice chemistry. This puts at risk public and consumer safety in the province. As a result, the Association of the Chemical Profession of Ontario, the ACPO, has developed a proposed legislation to introduce licensure for chemists in our province. ACPO was constituted in 1963. We're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year and represents approximately 700 chemists in our province. In 1984, the province provided our association the capacity to administer the professional standards that are awarded to members with the title of Chartered Chemist, or CChem, i.e. right to title. So what I'd like to do in the next 3 or 4 minutes is introduce the ACPO to the panel, to the audience, for those who may not be familiar with the association, discuss a little bit about our raison d'etre, and provide you with some examples of why it's important to consider the profession of chemistry as a regulated practice, and then provide you with some of the benefits associated with it. So the ACPO, our vision, chemists are broadly and consistently recognized as professionals. The operative word there is they're recognized as professionals by regulators, by other professions, by industry, by the public, and by chemists. So that's our vision, is to ensure that recognition. Our mission, however, is to become a regulated practice through an act of Parliament. In other words, licensure. Why is this important? I'll cite some examples for you. Everybody remembers Walkerton. As a result, we have the Ontario Safe Drinking Water Act. But the problem at Walkerton, it was due to falsification of laboratory results. It resulted in 2 deaths. Some of you may remember in Hamilton, fine analysis laboratories. Fine analysis laboratories were shut down, essentially convicted for falsification of results. More recently in Mississauga, chemipharmaceutical laboratories, falsification of laboratory results. As a result of this falsification, 52 products were released into the public for consumption, pharmaceutical products, with data supporting their safety that it was made up. Recently, the chemotherapy drug formulations, the Marchese Hospital Solutions, incorrect dosage. That's a first-year chemistry mistake. And then finally, and this is outside of the province of Ontario, but it could happen here just as well as anywhere else, is Annie Dukin in the United States, a chemist indicted on 27 counts of fraud for falsification of results. Why these are important is there is no vehicle in law that prevents these individuals from going out the following day after being convicted and setting up practice again and calling themselves chemists. What does licensure mean to the practice of chemistry and to the public? Licensure, a license under a Professional Chemists Act, only allows individuals who have demonstrated specific educational, training, and ethical standards to practice as chartered chemists, to ensure competency amongst those chemical practitioners. What are the benefits? The benefits, it's a regulatory regime adhered to by all practicing chemists. You cannot, similar to the Engineering Act, you cannot practice engineering without being a PEng. Similarly, you should not be allowed to practice chemistry and put the public sector at risk based on your competency or lack thereof. The benefits of regulating the practice of chemistry would maintain a high level of competency in the chemical industry. Ethics and public accountability for professional chemists would be de rigueur. It would enhance the service and safety in the workplace and to the public. And then finally, it would provide an authoritative resource and voice on issues relating to chemistry. Where do we go to now? We go to individuals perhaps with questionable competency or as some would call charlatans. So with that, I've completed my pitch, and with the indulgence of the panel, I have a handout. What would any good pitch be without a handout? On the benefits of licensure. So I appreciate your taking the time and listening to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Terry. So Robin, you're next to give the perspective of the Association of Certified Engineering Technicians and Technologists. And you've got a presentation. So
Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, panel. Where are we? I have control here. How do I get down? There we go. 5 bullets to cover off in the next few minutes. Enhancing Ontario's productivity without compromising safety. Fostering in-house career tracks for engineering professionals. Transparency of licensing. Development, attraction, and retention. And finally, outreach and awareness. The first bullet, as labor shortages emerge that will only be exacerbated by pending retirements, as Ontario's manufacturing sector continues to struggle, while Canadian labor markets wane. We don't need more restrictive. I would suggest we need more flexible labor arrangements with the right talent at the right price available to the work and be accountable for safeguarding worker and public safety. The jurisdictions of Western Canadian provinces with the most acute labor shortages and expanding economies are leading the way in innovative approaches to regulations designed for employees those that are capable of doing the work safely, including the trades, technicians, technologists, and engineers. Specifically in Saskatchewan, the qualified person dealing with environmental remediation, coming out of the BC Safety Authority for non-licensed electricians, providing limited electrical work. The M license over in Manitoba, again in the electrical field, working in building automation sector. And in Alberta, the PTEC Eng, very similar to the LET program here in Ontario. Fostering in-house career tracks for engineering professionals. In the development of the presentation, there was a number of interactions with senior executives, both in industrial and manufacturing sector. And what I heard was their desire to maintain and enhance the core talents of engineering. In addition to, and it was spoken to earlier this afternoon, in addition to attracting more internationally trained talent, as well as, and the young gentleman that I shared the table with today, encouraging younger people to consider careers in engineering. And we need to enhance those career paths that offer and pay and provide recognition while remaining in the technical focus. Again, in summary, a concern within the industry that engineering professionals are seeking careers in management for pay and recognition, not staying technically focused. We all recognize an earlier slide this morning, the aging demographic and workforce, challenges, ongoing challenges of knowledge transfer, and we need to both foster and promote competitive and attractive technical career paths. Transparency of licensing. On the broader level, as professional associations, we should be exploring how we can support academic changes to reduce the barriers. Pardon me, skipped a page. A number of executives that work in industry and manufacturing did identify some concerns with respect to the existing licensing regime, specifically associated with the limited license. I think that thread has come up a number of times today. And there is this fear and perception that PEO still remains somewhat bureaucratic in that process. On the broader level, as professional associations, we should be exploring how we can support academic changes to reduce the barriers from college graduates moving into degree programs, to provide for seamless opportunities and pathways, and the need to make sure that we provide outreach to attract and retain young people in engineering careers. Outreach and awareness. I'd suggest that this is one of the exemplary areas where the partnerships among the engineering associations, PEO, OSPE, Engineers Without Borders, and OCEPP have collaboratively worked at advancing National Engineering Month, identifying and ensuring that it's understood from a public perspective the issues of importance to our profession. Finally, in the development of these themes, the 5 points, there were a number of individuals that provided some assistance. I'd like to say thank you to Mark Turney, VP of Viridian, Rolando Lopez, Director of EXP, Kathy Lorette, VP of Horizon, John Hassan, Senior Vice President of AECOM, Tony Toma, Dean of Mohawk, Christine Barrick-Bowes, Dean of Seneca, and a number of senior staff and volunteer leaders at OCEPP. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. We're now going to ask Dan to give the perspective of the Association of Interior Designers.
I'm going to be real quick, so you don't even need to use that little tag thing. I'm going to start with a quote, just to sort of get us to see if we're all on the same page, and trying to lean into my question that way. Learn everything you can, anytime you can, from anyone you can. There will always be a time when you will be grateful you did. So my question is this, and I only have one. Our topic is continuing education. So perhaps we would like to talk about why the Professional Engineers of Ontario, and I specify Ontario, don't need to have CEU or continuing education credits. So the maintenance of a professional standard through continuing education, or more broadly professional development, is a standard required by all professionals. Architects and interior designers mandate continuing education. So why again, and I'm going to ask the same question, do Ontario engineers, professional engineers, not feel that continuing education helps validate their credentials? Architects and engineers were exempt from Bill 124 because the courts deemed there was responsibility of the PEO to regulate their members. The requirement of Bill 124, the requirements of Bill 124 were to demonstrate building code knowledge. While the PEO felt that the government should not impose qualifications on their members, why did they not feel that the underlying principles of Bill 124 was important to their members? So I'm going to ask the question again. What contributes to professional engineers' ongoing continuing education and learning? Working in the field, yes. Volunteering with your professional association, yes. But continuing education also comes by the way of courses, whether it be about building code or about modifications and alterations in the practice of your profession. So I think that matters, and that's my question. Okay.
That's a good question. Second last, Bill, we'll get the perspective of the consulting engineer.
Hi, I have no slides. I'll be a little bit longer than you, but not too much. Thanks for the invitation to come here today on behalf of consulting engineers. Just by way of introduction, Consulting Engineers of Ontario represents 200 firms with 18,000 engineers as members in the province of Ontario. Our mission is to promote a sustainable business environment for our members, and our vision is to be the authoritative voice of consulting engineering companies in Ontario, and focuses on the companies, not the individual engineer. One of our 4 strategic goals has application to this discussion in the area of government relations, wherein we strive to shape public policy, legislation, and regulations in the interest of our members. In the preamble that went out with the conference notice, it asked the participants to delve into some of the most pressing issues regarding engineering regulation and policy. That being the case, I'd like to raise 2 issues directly related to engineering regulation, and a third topic related to regulatory approvals that impact our engineers and the engineering industry in Ontario. And from my perspective, I took a look at it, and I see regulatory impacts on engineers and engineering at 3 different levels: at the individual engineer level, at the engineering firm level, and on the engineering industry. I'm getting to the questions coming. Impact number 1 on the individual engineer. PEO offers a consulting engineer designation. However, that consulting engineer or CE holder is treated no differently than the PEng from a practice standpoint. PEO has stated that there's no intention to differentiate between the two. Are the criteria used to grant the CE too subjective? While the Professional Engineers Act makes reference to the examinations for the CE candidates, it appears that decisions made by the CEDC, or the Consulting Engineer Designation Committee, are purely based on application materials and sometimes on personal interviews. Should there be a clear practice and regulatory distinction between the two? If a designation is granted and implies that it in some way distinguishes the holder from the PEng holder, a distinction in regulation with respect to practice should exist. And following from Deanna, on another note, I also raised the issue of where does continuing education for all PEng holders fit into this picture? And perhaps a more innovative approach to professional development can ensure that the individuals practicing engineering in the consulting sector are continually upgrading their skills to ensure the protection of the public safety. Impact number 2, talking at the level of the engineering firm now. Any entity with a valid certificate of authorization can offer engineering services to the public. Does this in fact protect public safety? Should regulation be tightened in the qualification of those companies and individuals who will be offering engineering services, design service particularly, that will ultimately impact public safety? That's a question. My third question, or third impact, is on the engineering industry. And this goes somewhat back to this morning. There's a little bit of an impact with respect to policy and the non-technical elements of our sector. Infrastructure renewal, redevelopment, and growth are critical to creating and maintaining a vibrant economy. While some self-regulation initiatives are being seen, and Marcia talked this morning, leading the modernization of the approvals process for water and wastewater, which is great. Some regulatory approvals processes they're complex and onerous, and they're becoming more so. Project proponents now need to satisfy Class EA environmental assessment process, conservation authority requirements, and respond to all manner of agency and public interest groups during design and execution. On top of that, jurisdictional debates between towns and cities, municipalities, and the province can contribute to lengthy and often unwarranted delays in approving and constructing new and renewal projects. Regulatory impacts can be seen in all of these areas. I guess the question is, are these processes and protocols really serving the public good? Project deferrals and delays negatively impact the consulting engineering industry and can impact public safety depending on the individual project. While this topic may not be directly related to regulation of the profession, I wonder if something could be done within our governance and regulatory structures that would lead to an improvement in our perceived credibility as engineers in the eyes of the policymakers and the larger public, and perhaps lead to faster approvals processes overall. Thank you.
So our last prepared speaker is Mark from Engineers Canada.
Thank you, and thanks for having me here today. The question I would like to ask to the group today would be, should we be concerned about what people from outside of the profession are thinking about the profession? I think we addressed these issues a little bit throughout the day. I was actually crossing out some stuff that was mentioned earlier, so I don't have many sheets left, but that's fine. Right now, at the national level in Ottawa, we're noticing that the regulatory environment is being pushed by the federal government into a consistency nationwide between the provinces, between the territories. The federal government is not necessarily concerned about the fact that there are different engineering acts, architecture acts. They just want to know that people can travel from one province or territory to the other and get a job, and foreign credential recognition can be done quickly, one-stop shop. You're recognized in Canada as having education, engineering education, you can now go get a job. I'll give a couple of examples, and what Engineers Canada is doing right now is that we are working on the Canadian framework for licensure, which is called CFL, nothing to do with football, just licensure. And basically what that is we're developing fundamental documents that's going to help the regulators across the country improve the legislation concerning engineering in their territory. And so that work has been going on for a while. And one of the issues we're dealing with is the recognition of the credentials. The government right now, there's a few things they're talking about. A couple of years ago, they passed the Act for full mobility from one province to the other. Well, now they are asking for the regulatory bodies to get together, as I mentioned a moment ago, to provide a one-stop shop for immigrants coming to Canada. So you're from India, you want to come work to Canada, you go to one destination to get your credentials recognized, your experience and your education recognized. Once you're in Canada, you don't have to go shopping for a license in any of the provinces. You're recognized. One of the processes they're thinking of doing, which has been recently announced, is that, and it's basically a process where people will show their interest in coming to Canada to work as an engineer. The engineering firm can then go through this list and say, oh, okay, this person has the credentials, I'm hiring him or her. So there's no more a priority list about who applied first. So the federal government is moving forward with these processes. So I think that we have to be aware of what the federal government is thinking. We have to be part of that conversation. We touched earlier today about, okay, how do we talk to them? How do we explain to them? One issue I touched on earlier when I presented Stephen was communications aspect. There's not a lot of communication right now being done between the regulatory bodies and the federal government. It's being done on paper, letters, proposals, but we have to make it plain and simple and explain to them what the impact is about the acts that they're proposing to pass at the federal level. Finally, I think what I want to say is I skimmed the issues very lightly because everybody else touched on it. Don't want to take more time. But I think we have to be aware of those opinions. Federal government is calling us at Engineers Canada to get our opinion on some issues and to share their opinions. Basically, they said to us, be part of that process to recognize foreign credential recognition. It's going to happen anyway. So that's it.
Okay, we certainly covered a range of issues. What I'm going to do next is ask each of the panelists to come up and have 5 minutes to ask questions of their choice, speakers of their choice, and we'll see how it goes. Jackie?
Okay, thank you. Okay, hi. So thanks. I read through the material that you'd sent in advance, and I actually looked at each one of the pitches, and in some cases there were 4 pitches within one proposal. I looked at it from the point of view of who was the proposed regulatory champion, if there was in fact one. The other one was what is the problem, in fact, and if has the root cause of the problem been addressed, or what would be the next step to even determine that. What is the policy process solution that might be proposed, or again, what could be a possible next step that's suggested? And what's the justification for use of resource, and that's in terms of time and money, to put to this problem? And really justification from several perspectives. One is from the public safety point of view, and I would even broaden that actually to the overall public good. The other is from government, so what are the impacts from their perspective, and also for whoever would be champion, whatever organization would be basically having to administer this regulation. So I have, I guess, I have 5 minutes, is that right?
Roughly, yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to restrict myself to kind of the one key question that I had for each one. For the first presentation, this was regards to the chemists. I think I have to cross-reference here.
Yes, Terry, the question. Terry's the chemist.
The first one was actually, Paul's. Okay, with regards to your first point that you brought up, and this had to, this had to do with the potential. Let's see. It was regarding the certificate of authorization. I guess I'm just wondering what was currently being done, and how do we know it's not sufficient?
Nothing is being done, so it can't be sufficient.
How do we know that there's a problem?
There's a problem because people are having to import their own quality engineering programs where their customers insist on it,
Okay.
and where the customers don't insist on it, they do work without quality engineering. It'll be interesting to see what that mall collapse investigation comes up with, but clearly there was no independent review and approval of the work.
So really, this is about quality improvement within a business.
Absolutely.
And that's a business question, I
Right.
would argue.
The business is engineering, that's PEOs.
They make use of engineers, but it's up to them whether or not they make garbage or they make good quality stuff that someone will actually pay for.
I would disagree with you. That's what the certificate of authorization is for, is to distinguish between the individual and the corporation. But they've never implemented corporate requirements for the certificate of authorization. So it's a $400 a year money grab.
I don't see a public safety issue unless there was a particular example
I just
that
gave
would
you
back
one.
up the problem.
I just gave you one, the mall collapse in Elliott Lake.
I don't, if you could be more clear on how that relates to, say, for example, within a manufacturing plant, or a design engineer within a manufacturing plant.
Well, let's take the nuclear program that I'm most familiar with. At one time, we used to do the work independently, no independent review and approval. We had all kinds of rework, and in a few cases, we had some near misses. I don't know if you know, but the first 2 or 3 years that Pickering was running, we challenged the safety system several times. Now, nobody challenges the safety system.
Okay, so there is maybe in specific industries.
Well, I don't know all the industries, but
Yeah.
the 3 or 4 that I'm aware of, there's always problems when an individual is doing safety-related work with no independent review and approval.
Okay, thank you.
And that's a quality assurance issue.
I'll move ahead, and with regards to your second point, and that had to do with setting standards, ignoring a PNG's advice. Is it possible that we could make our standards so high that it would be difficult for some companies to compete in the global marketplace?
Well, I guess the question is what's happening now, and a lot of engineering recommendations and reports were essentially ignored. We didn't talk about it earlier today, but I know privately there was a number of recommendations from the agencies not to roll out such a large wind and solar capability here in Ontario, and the engineers were overruled. Now we're paying $2 billion a year, or will by 2018 pay $2 billion more a year to run our electricity system, which is killing our manufacturing sector.
I guess, again, looking at a small manufacturer and what the impact might be to them, to something that would be overarching, would be a concern, but I don't really have it in the form of a question.
Well, one area that will affect, and it will be a problem, and that is what's it going to cost to get liability insurance if the engineering firm carries all the legal liability? And that's a valid question.
Okay.
And it needs to be answered as part of the dialogue. So it's not going to happen in a week. This is going to be a multi-year discussion.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. And then, well, with regards to the, I'll skip forward to the industrial exemption. And I guess a lot has been said about that. And so I'm going to skip forward to Robin and your presentation. And that one, I'll just remind myself, that one was with regards to the chemists. Oh, sorry. Okay. Oh, right. Okay. So, Robin, you had 4 points, and you propose that best practices from other provinces could be applied in Ontario. It sounds expensive to administer and to police all of these different licenses. Could this be realistic? Would this be realistic?
I think that's a very good question. And my answer to you and to the rest of the panel and to the participants today, if it can work in Manitoba, if it can work in Alberta, if it can work with the BC Electrical Authority, why can't it work in Ontario, and why will it be problematic from a cost perspective? So I don't have an answer. I just pose a question back. If it can work in those jurisdictions, why can't it work here?
Okay. Another question would be, thank you, and another question would be, I don't have an answer either, and that's a good point. Setting of exams so that they're comprehensive enough, not too easy, and people couldn't hire somebody to write them. Is that something that I would ask, should there be some oversight, and who would regulate that oversight or
I'm sorry,
administer that oversight.
I don't think I spoke to that point, but help me understand which point you're referring to.
Well, I guess if you didn't speak to it, let's skip forward. I guess I may have drawn a conclusion that I shouldn't have going forward. So I'll move forward. And then with regards to your second point, and actually I would say you had other points also that spoke to attracting, retaining, and developing talent and keeping talent in engineering and in other technology professions. This is really has overarching benefits with regards to labor, productivity, employment, and so on. And so I just have a comment, I suppose, which is this really a regulatory issue, or is it something else? And if it is something else, or if it is something else in which, for example, OCEPP or PEO should be a stakeholder in, what could that look like? Again, it's not a point you brought up.
There's a thread there, and perhaps it is not solely from a regulatory perspective. But I think we're fooling ourselves if we do not address that. Mm-hmm. We have problems from a productivity perspective, not only in the province of Ontario, but across North America.
Yeah.
How can we harness are they still there? The young engineers that I shared the day with, how can we entice others to pursue technical careers?
Right.
How can we address that? And I think that's a responsibility of the profession. Perhaps not from a regulatory perspective,
Yeah.
but from the profession's point of view.
Right, yeah, it would be, anyway, just another comment. I think that would be a great to figure out what the next step should be there. That's not, anyway. I had one for Terry. Do I still have time? No, okay, all right. Okay, well,
I'm sure
maybe
it's a
over
good one.
coffee.
See, you could have done a better job answering that question. Oh, yeah. But I'll do the.
You do the chemistry ones, I'll do
Thank you, Jackie. You whittled away a whole bunch of issues that I had, and they were answered, so thank you. I just had a couple of questions or observations that I had. One of them is to Terry, and one of the things that you're looking at is the chemical professions and to licensed, apparently, as I found out there. I wasn't sure, like I just learned today that they weren't licensed, so that's a concern to me. But if you're looking at a societal need, is there a need to license every profession? I look at a simple thing as when we went to France, every bakery has to have a master baker. And that's why bread is so good down there, okay? And that's the thing. When you go here, what does it take to become a baker here? I have a friend who was an engineer who had enough money to lease a place, buy the machines, and then tested the food on us. We all grew by 20 pounds by the end of the month. It was great bread, but that's what it takes. And chemists, I look at this, where does the industry stop licensing professionals? I assume a chemist is a professional, even though they're not licensed. And is this the way our society is going? I'm not saying if it's good or bad, but is this the way we're going?
Yeah, I think it might be going that way. I think any profession or any practice where the public interest could be affected by competency or adherence to a high standard of ethical practice would require some form of regulation. Otherwise, you're opening the door to the practice, or to individuals who lack the required standard of competency practicing. It's, the example that I use, and it is partly tongue-in-cheek, but it's true. If you're going to have somebody perform brain surgery on you, I would prefer it was a brain surgeon, not necessarily a plumber. So it's, if the public interest is affected, then yeah, I do believe that the profession should be regulated.
Okay.
To ensure that there is the proper standard of competency and ethical practice, the accountability and the responsibility.
See, I live in a very regulated business, profession, or call it whatever you call it. The engineers are regulated, the licensed electrical contractors are regulated, the master electricians are regulated, and we've done that in the last, especially the electrical trade in the last 5 to 7 years, and we've seen a higher standard being set. So it's one of those things. But my question here is, where do you stop? Is it just public interface or public involved, or the baker's a perfect example. Do the bakers need to be licensed? Where do you stop?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure where you stop. What I think about is when you look at a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So it was brought up earlier about the practice of engineering, and oftentimes a professional engineer is signing off on work that is done by others, I think for their own protection and to ensure that they're meeting their obligation to the public, that they would want the competent and perhaps regulated or licensed individuals providing support or providing input to that project.
Thank you. Next question I have is to Paul. And one of the items you mentioned was that the federal government is looking at oversight to making easier access of professionals to come in, so one-ticket practice. How do you deal with all the individual provincial differences that we have? And there are differences. Quebec has different rules of entering. You cannot enter Quebec without having Quebec permission. It has nothing to do, so Canada could accept you, but before you enter Quebec, you need them. They have they have an immigration department separate, and the rest of Canada doesn't. It's basically the Canadian process. So how do you expect, so Canada can say, great, you have a one ticket, but if provincially you won't do that, for instance, won't accept it, you give the impression that if you get that ticket to practice, you actually have it countrywide, but you might not. And then conflicts happen when the person starts working and some association says, you don't have the authority, well, I got it from Canada. How do you deal with these kind of stuff?
Actually, you said, Paul, I think it was Mark that made the comment. But I will comment on one thing. The federal government doesn't comply with the Engineering Act. They don't have an Engineering Act for federal buildings. Federal buildings are not subject to the Professional Engineers Act in the provinces, because federally regulated industries aren't subject to provincial legislation. So there is no Professional Engineers Act in Canada for buildings built under federal jurisdiction. Sorry, guys.
So what
Anyways, but go ahead and answer the question. I think you're the one to raise the jurisdictional stuff from Engineers Canada.
First, for the issue about Quebec, well, we just don't address it per se because they have their own immigration process. So we just don't get involved with that, and OIQ and L'Ordre des Ordres will take care of their aspect for the other professions. What's happening with the policy basically that the federal government is proposing is that the recognition of the credentials are done in one venue as opposed to what they call internally shopping for an association to get your license. So if I'm interested, I'm not sure what province I want to go in, live in, I can go to one organization. They will, based on the criteria from the different regulatory bodies, assess that my education, my work experience, my language skills are at a certain level that is acceptable in Canada to get licensed. Then that information that I'm acceptable is shared with the constituent associations. Then I would apply for my license at PO or New Brunswick or wherever it is that I want to go to.
Okay, thank you. And next question that I have was raised by Deanna, and this is concerning the continuing education for professional engineers, as well as others, but professional engineers specifically. I know there was something raised by the PEO a number of years ago on should there be continuing education. I know there was town hall meetings and all this kind of stuff, and I think it was killed, and nothing happened to it. And I look at me as an engineer and I say, every day I'm learning something. What more do you want me to do? Like, if you ask me anything on the engineering aspect that I work in, I probably know more than the average person or the average engineer just by virtue of being in there and reading the documents and reading all the stuff and going through the plans from a different aspect. So what else is needed? Are you looking at specific requirements? It's more of are you looking more as a sign-off that I've done this or attended this, or this will be prescribed courses that I have to attend?
Well, I think both, actually. So it's for everyone to know that you actually do have continuing education learning. So yes, I alluded to that when you're in the practice, you are learning every day, agreed. But as you're going through the practice and as you're sort of learning and moving through your profession, you always need to be at the place of the highest level of education. And it's not necessarily true that everyone is at that same place. So you might be one, but another person beside you may not be. So I think having a way of ensuring that everybody is at that same level is what we're asking. And that is the only way to prove that is to actually have you go through and sort of document the things that you've been doing through the course of the year.
Okay, but as I said, the PO had a review in the past, and it was kiboshed, so.
Well, then the question then is no different than my colleagues here is, it works in Alberta, it works in Manitoba, so why can't it work here, right? Other provinces are doing this, and there's a reason that they're doing it, is because it's important. And if the architects and the Interior Design Association and other professionals find that it's important, why do the engineers not? Why do the professional engineers not?
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to try something a little different. I picked up some common themes, and I'm going to pitch a few of these themes out that way, and then try and answer some of the questions that were posed, at least from the notes I was able to take down. One of the key things, since we're in a policy conference and we're talking about regulatory policy, I'll just give a little bit of regulatory overview as to PO, why we exist. I mean, it's a good question. Would PO, would an association like PO today be able to get self-regulation? Because there's a number of you out there that have the common theme, the chemists, the technologists, and Arito. And that's a good question for us to look at, and perhaps I'm leaving that to some of the counselors in our governing body there. But keep in mind that the thrust of a regulatory body is really basically this, and it gets mixed up, so it's important that we listen to what it is. We regulate, and the only way we can do that is, of course, create regulations, and that's got to link to government, which then means it's got to link to the public, in the interest of the public. So we're not regulating for safety. If that were true, we wouldn't be able to drive cars out of here, nobody would get hurt, nobody would fall. But we regulate in the interest of the public. So when we create regulations, on our council does, it should base it on the basis of, is this good for the interest of the public, as opposed to the self-interest, notwithstanding we're a self-regulatory body. And the second key issue is the issue of competency, and I'm going to answer Arito's question if I can. But the question is, how do you measure it? I know you said Alberta has it and others have it and your group has it. But more importantly, it would be in terms of a public policy, the question for me always is, I go to my general practitioner as least often as possible. I'm happy to go because I understand it's funded. It's not coming out of my pocket, so if I've got time to kill and PO is not keeping me busy, I'll go see the GP. I have no way of knowing if this individual is competent. What I do have, and maybe it's because of the work I have, is I have some sense of comfort knowing that I can hardly make out what school they graduated from, because it's usually well behind their desks, but that they're a member of the College of Physicians and Surgeons. So I applaud those that are looking for self-regulation, but I ask the big policy question in terms of the public policy. What's in it for the public policy? Just to suggest that licensure from Terry's position is an important thing. It's a solution. And it gets me to my next thing, which is, I knew nothing about policy when I joined PO as a staffer. I've been there for a number of years. I've heard all kinds of spins on the word policy, from big P, little p, all kinds of P's. I'm not even sure. What I will state is this: solution-based policy, as opposed to what I heard today was evidentiary-based policy, is fraught with problems. And it's fraught with problems because when I present my solution, and whether I consult with you or seek your input, it's my solution. I'm driving a solution, and if you don't agree with the problem that I've never defined to you, we're going to start polarizing, and we're going to become eventually very personal at it. And once you get into the personal arena, there is no public policy, in my humble opinion. So an important part of anybody seeking their own legislature over there is to start considering a little broader in terms of, okay, are you doing this because it's a solution-based, or can you actually define a problem where you fit in? And I would urge the groups that are looking for self-regulation that one of the most important things is public accountability, and I think you made that statement loud and clear. So I would invest time and money if I had, if I was king of the day, on front-end problem definition. I'd consult a little more broadly on agreement on the problem, because if we don't have a common problem, the solutions, the engineering solution, the 19 out of 20 solutions, they're all adequate. The people pitching those, I'm going to tell you right now, will go to their grave to prove to you that it is the solution, as you heard. but without having a measure as a drawback of this is the problem we defined, we all agreed this was the problem. Does this solution hit 9, 10, or 9/10 of it, or 10, or 100% of what we were looking for? The answering of some questions, going to the Aritos, I think PEO has looked at continuing education, is considered it. Council has not come down on it yet, and it's primarily because I think the understanding the problem definition from the myriad of types of practitioners we have makes that problem super complex. I know that it was said that it was complex. There's a lot of interdependence there. I'm very hopeful that, as I heard, if there's a calamity, it's going to ring and put focus on that, and I think we're going to have to deal with it. We do have the power under the legislation to impose it. There's a couple of councilors here that could make it happen if they could get a few of their people around the table to vote it in. So to answer your question, I think it's inevitable. Getting to the C of A questions that were posed earlier, I would just want to make sure that people understand what the certificate of authorization is. The other professions were not able to incorporate, not until a few years ago. We were one of the few. And basically the government created this little patch called the certificate of authorization, and it's worded in the following. An entity cannot practice engineering, it can only engage in providing that so long as there is a professional engineer who can be held accountable from the licensure perspective. And that's critical. So getting to your answers, Paul, absolutely, they could put requirements to at least authenticate that that entity is capable of providing the services that it tells the certain public that it can do that. Again, is there a will and is there a good problem definition? I think one of the biggest problems we have, and having worked at PO 18 years, is, like I said, when you go to solution-based, we have a solution for that problem of yours. We haven't really understood the whole problem definition, and there's a myriad of organizations that hold certificates of authorization, as I'm sure you understand. And when I used to run that program, I used to get a letter a year or two from one particular guy saying, there's another $300 down the drain. And it was difficult to explain what that person was getting out of it. And I just had one more question to answer that I was going to take, and it wasn't Robin. Sorry about that, Robin, but I didn't have an answer for your particular one. Mark, yes, there it is. Yeah, Mark, you're absolutely correct. From a communications perspective, I would want to know what the public really thinks about the engineering profession as a whole. And one of the things we lack, I mean, I've been at table meetings where we huddle and we say, aren't we good? Aren't we doing it really, really, really well? Sure we are. As long as we're together, we're always doing well. We've never asked the outside. We've never pitched that. We haven't had I understand we use SurveyMonkeys to all our known entities as opposed to our unknown entities. So back to my original discussion on the public policy. In my humble opinion, public policy would do a lot better if we define the problem by getting all the outsiders' perspectives on it, and then give it to the subject matter experts to come up with a couple of choices, as you heard today from the players who actually played down at Queen's Park, a couple of solutions, because you may not be able to just implement that one. So once we get the subject matter experts, then we got to kick in the jurisdictional powers, and I see the three counselors trying to hide their heads there, but it has to happen through them, because that's the governing body of a profession that's self-regulated, and they will put regulations out, I'm quite sure of it, in the interest of the public as opposed to the self-interest of individuals like myself or anybody else who's holding a license. Hopefully I got into the 5 minutes there.
That's great, John. Hey, Gary. Okay, we're at the top of the hour. Gary has one burning question, and then we're going to try to open up to the floor.
Actually, I have two. But my questions will be like me, short and rounded. So, Terry, ACPO, interesting initiative. And I'm all one for certification, setting standards, getting people to be measured, looking at public safety. But today we have chemical technologists, we have pharmacists, we have chemical engineers, and we have chemists. Isn't there a possibility that as we go forward and look at certifying chemists, that we begin in the public's eye to blur the lines of rather than focus on who a chemist really is, that we actually begin to blur the lines of who a chemist really is, and at the same time run the risk of it decertifying in the public eye the chemical practices that are out there?
The first part of your question about blurring the lines, I think part of the process requires a very clearly defined scope of practice. You said it, what is, how do you define a chemist? What is a chemist? I think, you know, the same thing applies to any regulated practice. How do you define engineering? This has always been a challenge. It's interesting, I flew back late last night from Quebec City, and I had an opportunity to meet with the CEO and the executive director of the Ordre des Chimistes de Quebec. They are a regulated practice, and they've just spent the last 4 years working with the other regulated professions in Quebec, defining scopes of practice. So what you're seeing now is well-defined scopes of practice, but there's a certain level of consistency between them, so that you're trying to mitigate any blurring of those lines. But at the same time, there has to be the recognition, I think. You brought up chemical engineers and chemists, and I've thought about that, you know, because we have members in the association who are chemical engineers. But I would suggest that just like the PEO or the Engineers Act and the Architects Act, there has to be some vehicle or some accommodation to evaluate overlapping practices that way. And this is how I got involved with, it was referred to earlier, the Natural Science and Engineering Task Force that was struck when the definition of engineering was, when they removed the exclusion clause for natural sciences. So it's a complex question. There's no doubt about that. But I believe that, you know, there are solutions to it, and I think we're starting to see that, particularly coming out of Quebec.
Okay. I would closing comment on that area. I would suggest that probably one of the things that we need to do, and again, this is to Engineers Canada also, and the consulting engineers, is somehow, somewhere, come up with a definition of what a certified professional is. It sounds rather generic. But what does a certified professional do? And to the previous speaker's comments, at the end of the day, it's not so much what we think it means, but it's really where the value really is, and that's in the public eye. I think there needs to be significant stakeholder out there as to what do people out there, what do the people who actually pay the bills think a certified professional is. So that's just my closing comment on that. Last question is to Deanna. So Deanna, continuing education. Just to let you know, personally, I am a hard advocate of continuing education. People who work for me know every year they have to do it. Having said that, though, in the field of engineering today, we do work that must apply to significant codes and standards. There are codes and standards, whether it's CSA, whether it's ESA, IEEE, whatever. And these things are regulated, updated every day. Many of us here may sit on standard writing committees. With our need to be up to date and to be conversant with that, and if we're not, then there are people in the room who will deal with us appropriately based on the regulations. How do you balance that with your call for the need for continuing education? Isn't that need to stay up to date with the standards, to stay up to date with the codes, to practice professionally and for the safety of the public, isn't it the same thing?
It's part of, I think it's part of it, but I don't think it's all of it. So a part of it is for us to be able to know across the board within your own profession, and then to sort of have others witness that someone has gone and actually has addressed those measures. So what I find that's helpful, both whether it be in the Architectural Association or the Interior Design Association, which I'm familiar with both, is that we have a way of recording and understanding what each member or which each member of the association has sort of done and has learned. And that's a way of sort of keeping everybody at the same level. But I do think that code or building code issues are dealt with by a learning, and that you need to be present at those courses to sort of know what's going on. And that is not part